All right, so we're diving into Noam Chomsky today, and wow, did you give me a lot to read, especially from the Chomsky Reader. This is going to be interesting.
Chomsky's work is more relevant than ever, I think. It's like he gives us a new way to see how power works, especially now with all the information flying around and how divided everyone is politically.
Yeah, it's like a decoder ring or something, right? And I think a good place to start is his critique of U.S. foreign policy.
Right.
Like right away, he comes out swinging, saying that American life is built on this system of indoctrination.
And he's not just saying that it shapes how we think, but that it makes us numb to the suffering caused by America's actions in other countries. Like when people talk about American exceptionalism to justify our interventions in other countries,
Right, right.
Chomsky would say that kind of thinking makes it hard to see the damage we do.
So it's not that he thinks America is uniquely bad, just that we need to be honest with ourselves about our mistakes.
Yeah, exactly. He wants us to really look in the mirror as a nation, and I think the Vietnam War is a perfect example of what he's talking about. He says it wasn't just a mistake, but part of a bigger pattern of U.S. intervention around the world.
And he really goes deep, too, right? He talks about U.S. pilots bombing South Vietnam way back in 1962. That's years before things are supposed to have escalated.
Yeah, he documents it meticulously and challenges the way we usually think about the war.
It's definitely not how I learned it in school. So why do you think this perspective on Vietnam is so often ignored, even by academics?
Well, Chomsky says the truth about Vietnam is like this forbidden topic in America because it shows us a side of American imperialism that a lot of people don't want to deal with.
It kind of ruins the image of America as a force for good in the world, right?
Exactly. Like we're pulling back the curtain and seeing how things really work. And that's what makes Chomsky so interesting, even if you don't always agree with him. He makes you face some hard truths.
And speaking of hard truths, what about his idea of manufacturing consent? How the media and the people in charge shape what the public thinks?
That idea has been around for a while.
Yeah.
Chomsky actually draws on the work of Edward Bernays, this guy who was a pioneer in public relations. Bernays was all about engineering consent, basically managing how the public thinks, especially in democracy.
But for Chomsky, it's not like some big conspiracy. It's more about how certain ideas become so normal that we don't even question them.
Right.
Like we're breathing air and we don't notice it until it's polluted.
Right, and he uses some pretty powerful examples from his own research, like how the American media always avoided saying American invasion of South Vietnam, even though, as we talked about earlier, the U.S. was involved long before that.
But they didn't hesitate to say Russian invasion of Afghanistan when that happened. Seems a bit like a double standard, right?
Absolutely, and it's not like it's always intentional either. Chomsky's point is that the media often acts like a gatekeeper, deciding what ideas are acceptable, and that often ends up reinforcing the power structures that are already in place.
So even if no one's actively trying to control what we think the result is, that we end up with a distorted view of reality.
Right.
We're basically being fed a sanitized version of events that serves the interests of the powerful. It makes you wonder how.
How can we even think critically when the information we rely on is being filtered like that?
Right.
And that leads us to Chomsky's ideas about the role of intellectuals, which I think are even more relevant now than ever before.
Hold on. Before we get to that, let's take a minute to recap what we've covered so far. We've got Chomsky's critique of American foreign policy, his idea of how the media manufactures consent, and this unsettling idea that we might be more indoctrinated than we realize. That's a lot to process.
Yeah, it is a lot. But we're just scratching the surface here. When we get into Chomsky's ideas about intellectuals, you'll see how urgent his message is, especially now in the age of information overload.
Okay, so let's take a break and we'll be back soon to unpack all of that.
Stay tuned. It's about to get even more interesting. Welcome back. Let's talk about Chomsky's take on intellectuals, because it really connects to what we were just talking about with public perception and all that.
Yeah, and it's interesting how he doesn't just criticize powerful institutions, but also intellectuals themselves, especially the influential ones.
He says intellectuals shouldn't just be experts in their fields, but that they have like a moral duty to challenge unfair power structures.
It's like he's saying, don't just sit around and think about things. Get out there and do something.
Exactly. He really criticizes those who focus on being experts, but ignore ethical questions, especially when it comes to things like foreign policy or war. Like with the Vietnam War, he points out how academics and scientists helped the war effort without really thinking about whether it was right or wrong.
So it's not enough to just be smart, you have to use your intelligence for good. He makes this point about how everyday people can analyze sports in such detail, but when it comes to politics, their conversations are often very superficial.
Right.
Why do you think that is?
Well, Chomsky would probably say that it's partly because there's a deliberate effort to make politics seem too complicated for ordinary people to understand.
Okay.
So we end up feeling like we need to rely on experts, which basically lets the people in power control the narrative.
So we're conditioned to be passive and just accept the information we're given instead of being actively involved in politics.
And Chomsky wants us to break out of that. He challenges intellectuals to use their knowledge to empower others to show people how power really works so they can make their own informed choices.
So how does all this fit in with his critique of American imperialism and the media's role in manufacturing consent?
It's all connected. He sees these things working together to keep things the way they are. American imperialism often needs the public to support it, and that's where the media comes in, shaping how people view events.
Right.
And when intellectuals stay silent or even actively support these systems, they're basically helping to keep them going.
So it's not just about pointing out injustice overseas, it's about challenging the systems of power here at home, starting with how we get information and how it's presented to us. It's a call to be informed, to be engaged, and to keep questioning what we're being told.
Which brings us to another fascinating aspect of Chomsky's work, one that might seem unconnected at first, but it actually sheds light on his whole way of thinking.
You mean in his work in linguistics? That was definitely the most unexpected part of what you gave me to read, but also the most intriguing, I have to say.
It's like a hidden doorway into the core of his ideas. It might seem like a big leap, but stick with me, it's worth exploring.
Okay, I'm ready to take that leap. But first, can you remind me what universal grammar is exactly?
Imagine this. You're born with a language instinct, like a set of rules already in your brain that helps you understand and create sentences, even if no one ever taught you those rules.
Okay.
That's basically Chomsky's theory. He says all humans, no matter their culture or language, have this built-in ability for language.
So it's not like we're blank slates when it comes to language. We're already wired for it from the start.
Yeah. And that's what makes us different from other animals, according to Chomsky, is the foundation of our ability to think abstractly, to reason, and to be creative.
That's fascinating, but how does this relate to his views on power structures in the media? It still feels like a bit of a jump.
Here's where it gets mind-blowing. Chomsky believes this innate ability for language, this creative power within us, is also the basis for human freedom and our need to express ourselves. He sees language as a tool for breaking free, for challenging authority and fighting oppression.
So the very act of using language to question things, to challenge and to disagree, it's like we're tapping into this deep human potential for freedom.
Yes. And that's what makes his critique of manufacturing consent even more powerful. If our ability to use language is the key to our freedom, then those who control information, those who twist words to manipulate public opinion, are basically attacking our very humanity.
Wow, that's a pretty heavy thought. It makes the issue of media manipulation seem much bigger than just controlling what we know. It's about limiting our potential of human beings.
Exactly. And it circles right back to his call for intellectuals to be forces for good in the world. If they can understand how language works, if they can break down the stories used to prop up power structures, then they can help empower others to think for themselves and to resist manipulation.
It's like they're giving people the tools to see through the propaganda, to challenge the way things are, and to use their own voices to make a more just world.
Exactly. And then the final part of our deep dives will explore this even further, looking at how Chomsky's work in linguistics actually lays out his vision for a fairer and more just world.
Okay, so we're back, and I'm still thinking about what we talked about last time. It's crazy to think that the way we use language could be connected to Chomsky's whole worldview.
Yeah, it is kind of mind-blowing, but it starts to make sense when you realize how important language is to everything we do. It's how we think, how we talk to each other, how we understand the world around us. And Chomsky believes it's also tied to our freedom and our ability to fight against oppressive systems.
I remember you said he sees language as a tool for liberation. Can you explain that a little more?
Sure. Remember how Chomsky says we're all born with this ability for language, this universal grammar?
Right.
It lets us understand and create sentences in so many complex ways. It's like this creative force inside us, full of possibilities.
So it's like we've got this superpower, this ability to use language to make meaning, express ourselves, and connect with other people.
Exactly. And Chomsky argues that This ability to use language in new and creative ways is also the basis for our ability to think critically and to resist control.
So it's not just about speaking properly, it's about using language to question things, to challenge authority, and to imagine different ways the world could be.
Exactly. And that's where his political beliefs really come into play. He sees the way language is manipulated as a major way to oppress people.
You mean things like propaganda and political spin, all those ways that words are used to control and manipulate us?
Yes, but it goes deeper than that.
Yeah.
Chomsky argues that the very structure of language can be used to reinforce power structures. Like, think about the passive voice.
Yep.
It can be used to hide who's responsible for something, to make it sound like actions just happen without anyone doing them.
Like saying mistakes were made instead of we made mistakes. It's a small change in wording, but it changes how we see things.
Exactly. And Chomsky is brilliant at breaking down these subtle ways that language is used to shape how we understand the world.
So learning to see through these tricks in language is a way of becoming more powerful. It helps us think more critically, to see things more clearly, and to resist being controlled.
Right. And that's where Chomsky's call for intellectuals to make a difference comes in. If we can understand how the language of power works, how it hides its biases and manipulations, then we can help others to do the same.
It's like giving people the tools to dismantle the machinery of oppression.
That's a great way to put it. And it's not just academics and writers, it's anyone who can analyze language and see through the spin and the propaganda. It's about being critical of the information we're given, no matter who we are or what we do.
So if we think about the world today, with all the news and social media and different opinions flying around, what would Chomsky say? How are we doing at resisting all these forces that are trying to shape what we think?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think Chomsky would say we need to be careful to never take anything at face value and to always look closely at where information comes from.
Right.
He'd remind us that we have the tools to do this thanks to his work and the work of many others who have dedicated themselves to exposing how power really works.
It can feel overwhelming sometimes, like you have to be constantly on guard, analyzing everything and questioning every story you hear. But you're right, we do have the tools. We just need to learn how to use them.
And the more we use them, the better we get at seeing the patterns, at recognizing the subtle ways language is used to influence us. It's like exercising a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
This deep dive into Chomsky's work has been really amazing. We've talked about everything from American foreign policy to the structure of corporate power to the nature of language itself and the human mind. And somehow, it's all connected.
That's what's so fascinating about Chomsky's ideas. They're like threads from different parts of life, but when you see them together, they create a complete picture, a vision for a world that is more just and fair.
His work is a call to action, a challenge to think for ourselves, and a reminder that we all have a part to play in shaping the world we live in.
And maybe the most important message is that we're not helpless. We have the power to resist manipulation, to challenge the way things are, and to create a better future. We just need to be willing to use the tools we have, especially the most powerful tool of all, our language.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into the mind of Noam Chomsky, we'll leave you with this. What will you do with what you've learned? How will you use your understanding of language and power to make a difference? It's up to you.